We are cooking with gas and we don't care about the consequences. Overnight, using a gas stove over an electric stove became a signifier that you are a member of the right in America and a proud American, and you will not listen to the government, no matter what research they cite about what is safe for you to use and what is not. I'm Jessica Burbank. This is The Conversation. And today, to discuss this, we're delighted to be joined by Chris Lehmann, who's the DC bureau chief for The Nation, also a contributing editor with The Baffler. Thank you so much for joining us, Chris.
Thanks for having me, Jessica. Delighted to be here.
So let's talk a little bit about this. Do they just want to distract us from their pending mission to cut Social Security, or do they really care about gas stoves?
Well, the short answer is yes to the first half of your question. But of course, it's more complicated than that in the sense that, the American right is now addicted to outrage. That addiction escalated dramatically under the presidency of Donald Trump, who is just a walking grievance machine. Some of his most reliable lines at his rallies concern things like the outrage of wind turbines and toilets, that are meant to conserve water that don't flush properly, which is clearly TMI from our ex-president, but so be it. And allied sort of complaints that, these newfangled innovations in the broader political economy are personal affronts. And that is what's key, I think, is instead of debating on their merits, the pros and cons of regulating gas stoves more robustly or phasing in an eventual ban of gas stoves, the rhetoric on the right went straight to, these liberals are coming for your gas stoves. So that's an easy template. You can just insert like all the gun nut kind of rhetoric there. And in fact, Matt Gaetz tweeted out something to the effect of, "You'll take my gas stove from my cold, dead hands," which, first question is, how do your hands get cold next to a gas stove? You're not using it properly. And maybe if you didn't light the flame, that could explain why you're dead. I don't know. But yeah, this is all part of, the seemingly bottomless need on the American right to create this culture of intense grievance, usually in the, mad old white uncle mode. You remember things like the War on Christmas, which it was an annual right at Fox News. You would have, all of these spokes anchors lined up all across the primetime schedule on Fox, loudly complaining anytime someone said season's greetings instead of Merry Christmas. And that morphed into the, quote, War on Christmas, which last time I checked, the generals in that war sustained pretty heavy casualties. I don't think it's coming back. And that's the other thing is they, wear these out very rapidly. I mean, I wrote this piece on the gas stove war last week, and I'm already seeing there was something on Fox News about Xboxes. Like the entire consumer economy is apparently booby trapped for these people. It's quite an amazing thing.
And now it's the M&ms, right?
Oh, M&ms. How could I forget? Yeah, Tucker Carlson had a whole segment on that, and I guess we'll see some big reveal at the Super Bowl about. And it's very hard, honestly, even though it's kind of my job to track this stuff, to keep up without a long series of, I don't know, visits to a spa or something.
It's exhausting, right? Because there's cognitive dissonance there. There's the libertarian ethos of, these bureaucrats are trying to control your life with this regulation, which at the end of the day, we're seeing is consumer protection. And who's really being helped when they say we don't need consumer protection? It's the corporations who are profiting. But These same people that are preaching these libertarian ethos really are also trying to infringe upon a lot of our personal freedoms, like the LGBTQ plus community,
Yep.
the right to be themselves in public. What do you make of that cognitive
Yeah,
dissonance?
no, it is. I'm glad you pointed out that paradox, because it runs very deep, and yeah, it becomes that is not a joking matter. The targeting of the LGBTQ community, which, let us not forget, sort of grew out of the moral panic over critical race theory. That panic kind of flopped in the 2022 midterms. So now they're ramping up on these other fronts, even though Rick DeSantis, of course, who's angling for the presidential nomination for the GOP, is still, he has just banned African American studies in Florida high school. So he's still, holding down all the culture wars at once. But yeah, the other, this is something I meant to say in the piece I wrote, but, again, I think I just got too fatigued. But it used to be, the common critique of totalitarianism in the middle 20th century was that it was obviously morally objectionable in all sorts of other ways, but it allegedly politicized every aspect of domestic life. That, you would have these fascist youth brigades spying on their parents. You would have these propaganda initiatives targeting out groups. And the weird thing we're seeing now on the American right is they are taking up that intense politicization of every facet of life, from public school curricula to gas stoves to wind turbines to toilets, what have you, or Xboxes and M&ms. It's all political, and I think the classical conservatives in the mid 20th century would be appalled to see this happening, because it is in fact weaponizing the state, to use a favorite term of the GOP House these days, in the service of these bigoted culture wars, when they get aligned with the worst elements of the American right.
I liked how you wrote in this piece how similar Fox News programming is to stuff you would see on Facebook, but also this intertwinement between Fox News and the Gateses of the Republican Party. It's quite scary how they've created a machine where people no longer look to them to govern or create good policy or deliver public goods, but instead be on the right side of these culture war issues. What do you make of that?
Yeah, well, the culture war is kind of all that the American right has at this moment. They're not interested in governing. We saw that with the long, the Freedom Caucus's attempt to block the nomination of Kevin McCarthy to the speakership. That was all about getting key committee chairmanships in the House and getting rules changes to put these kind of issues front and center. So now we have, I joked about it earlier, but this new House committee on the, quote, weaponization of government is going to be looking into things like the Twitter files, which, that's a whole other rabbit hole, but it is basically, speaking of things that are tedious, it's just a chronicle of content moderation on a major social media site. It doesn't, show any nefarious censorship on any ideological grid. It's just, again, another way in which some use of a consumer product is being, in this case, not even regulated by the government, but by the private owners and operators of a platform. And even that's objectionable. One of the people I interviewed for this piece wrote a book on the recent, decline of libertarian thought. And he said, increasingly libertarians want to live in what any sort of rational political scientist would recognize as a failed state. And a failed state is not a place where you want to live, to put it mildly.
Right, definitely not. And from my perspective, I'm seeing what's going on in DC. They say, they're bureaucratic, they're acting like a nanny state, calling their policies overwhelmingly paternalistic. But to me, it's like, can you deliver some public goods? Can you ensure that Social Security is enough for people to live on in it? I saw someone post on Twitter, they've pretty much turned into an arms dealer. But this lack of good journalism and this distraction, I think is complicit with this development.
No, that's a really good point. And, the reason the right, there are two basic reasons why the right always recurs to this sort of culture war first agenda. As I said earlier, the first is to keep the base engaged and the outrage flowing. But the second is exactly to, make sure that no one pays attention to rampant tax cuts for the wealthy, to plans to roll back, outlays for essential social goods and services like Social Security and Medicare. That is the agenda behind the coming showdown over the debt ceiling. Again, the right doesn't care about fiscal responsibility, especially since this debt ceiling showdown is about money that was already spent, a good deal of it under the Trump administration that, the Republicans in Congress were more than happy to sign off on at the time. So, again, it's when the wheel spins and they are the out party in the White House, that's when they demonize government spending. And again, the reason that they want you to talk about M&ms and Xboxes and gas stoves is that they are, in fact, planning to go after Social Security and Medicare.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. This is just such a good perspective on the matter, and just to break down something that seems like a silly controversy and put it in the greater, political scope of what's happening in the country is super useful. So the article is Republicans are cooking up their dumbest controversy yet. Chris Lehmann for The Nation. Where else can our viewers find your work?
Oh, the Baffler is a place where I contribute from time to time. I finished a tour recently as a book reviewer for the New Republic, so there's a lot of that stuff there. Gosh, I don't know. On the conversation. So
amazing, great. Thank you so much for talking with us, Chris. We also have your Twitter handle as well for folks who are watching.
Excellent. Thanks for having me.